Good news, everyone! From October, I will be undertaking a PhD studying animal behavior and welfare, specifically in relation to animals housed in zoos. So I thought, to celebrate, why not do an episode on zoos? So, if you'd like to learn about their history, why they can be so controversial, and if we can build a more moral zoo of the future, which can hold its head up high in an increasingly moralistic world, well, please keep listening. Zoos have been around for much longer than you might think, starting their life as menageries, a type of zoological garden in which animals and plants would be kept. The first known menagerie has been identified from archaeological evidence as being from ancient Egypt, a menagerie dating back around 6,000 years. The animals kept there were baboons, lions, and crocodiles, and they were thought to be kept for religious reasons. However, they weren't the only ones keeping animals. We know the ancient Greeks and the Chinese also kept animals in menageries, but many of them were kept for entertainment purposes. Though I think we all know that the most famous people for keeping animals for entertainment were the Romans. A disturbing figure is that under Emperor Caligula, 400 bears were killed in a single day. Yet, that's not the worst of it. Under Emperor Nero, 400 tigers were made to fight bulls and elephants during just a single day's exposition at the Colosseum in Rome. Yet, these numbers are dwarfed by the 5,000 animals that died for entertainment under Emperor Titus. So, I think it's safe to say that it was a moral entertainment and not education or moral advancement that was the name of the game during the ancient world. Although, as time goes on, people's morals tend to change, and so during the medieval period, blood sports were out of fashion, and instead animals were kept in menageries as a sign of wealth, power and status. The most prominent collection of exotic animals in medieval England were kept in the Tower of London for the viewing pleasure of the infamous King John. Eventually, during the reign of Elizabeth I in the 16th century, the Tower of London was opened to the public, who could then marvel at the strange foreign creatures kept there, while also basking in the power of the monarch who made it possible. The oldest proper zoo in the world still in existence is the Schönbrunn Zoo in Vienna, which was built in 1752 at the order of Emperor Francis I, which was originally an imperial menagerie, part of the Schönbrunn Palace. However, personal menageries were on the way out as the Enlightenment brought in new ideas about moral progress, science and responsibility. Menageries therefore began to make the transition from royal domains to show one's power and influence into public zoological gardens, whose new goal was to conduct science and, if possible, educate the pesky locals about the natural world. In the 19th century, a fascination for natural history and zoology was growing around the planet, but especially within the British Empire, the fruits of which had made London big, wealthy, and urbanised. This led to an increased demand for a greater variety of public forms of entertainment to be made available. The need for public entertainment, as well as the requirement for scholarly research, came together in the founding of the first modern zoo, the most famous of which is London Zoo. London Zoo was opened for scientific research in 1828 and then to the public in 1847. London Zoo was even the first zoo to open a public aquarium, and this was in 1853. However, scientific progress does not always mean moral progress. The animals kept in these zoos were kept in what today we in the Western world would see as horrendous conditions, with many living their whole lives on bare concrete floors, surrounded by metal prison-like bars. Now, we can agree this is bad for the animals, but Europeans were also caging anyone who looked different from them and displaying them in human zoos. Now, I think it's okay to be fascinated by people's differences, but to put them on display like an animal, well, that's quite another thing. What's even more surprising is that the last known display of humans like this was a Congolese village, displayed at a show in Brussels in 1958. If these are the zoos of the past, we can clearly see that there is a mix of morals used in their creation, from the bread and circuses of the ancient world, through to the showing of power through self-aggrandizement in the medieval, onto amoral scientific discovery during the Enlightenment, and finally to the betterment of one's countrymen through education in the early modern period. It's not surprising, therefore, that the modern zoo has inherited much from this legacy, which affects how they are run and what their aims and goals are today. For instance, many modern zoos still try to display rare or hard to obtain animals with the aim of bringing in more visitors, and just like the monarchs of old, animals like the giant panda or polar bear can also be seen as a form of power and status display. However, these animals can also be very, very hard to house adequately, and this brings with it many welfare and moral implications. Despite their popularity, zoos have been the subject of controversy over the years. I know, colour me shocked. Many people argue that keeping animals in captivity is cruel and inhumane, and that these animals should simply be allowed to live their lives in their natural habitats. While others say that zoos play an important role in conservation and education, and that they help to raise awareness about endangered species. It's more complicated than all these non-nuanced views, however, because both hold an ounce of truth in them, and that's why places like zoos are complicated to deal with on a moral level. But things must continue to change. As our morals evolve, so too must how zoos operate. And it's how these changes will affect the zoo of the future that I'd like to speculate upon. Let's first concentrate on where zoos get their animals. In the past, these animals would have been captured in the wild and brought to live in a zoo. Nowadays, it's thankfully quite rare, with wild animals only ending up in zoos when they have been confiscated from the illegal wildlife trade. I'd expect the zoos of the future to continue to give these animals sanctuary, as the only other options are releasing them back into the wild, into potentially habitat that is unavailable for them, sending them to private sanctuaries, or terminating them, an option which is controversial in its own right, even more so if the animals are endangered. Therefore, the zoos of the future should probably provide these stolen animals a home, and they can even use it as a moral card in their deck when asked to justify their existence. Now, animals from the wildlife trade are not a zoo's only source of new inhabitants, because if you have a male and a female of many species, they can actually reproduce, making new baby animals, which can be housed at a zoo and are bound to bring in a greater number of visitors because they're so damn cute. This method is no doubt better than using wild caught animals, but it in itself has its own problems. The main one, in my opinion, is that by breeding animals in captivity over multiple generations, what you end up resulting in is an inbred population, and what you end up selecting for are animals that have become adapted to breed well in the safety of captivity, and these aspects have the potential to be devastating to a species, especially if they are to be released into the wildlands of their ancestors. So, how do we deal with this problem? Releasing predators into an enclosure is obviously a moral minefield. Couple this with restricted ranges of many enclosures, you play a game of completely wiping out your stock of prey, or having some very satisfied and full predators. So, that's obviously not an option. Perhaps you could use the presence of a predator as a threat. For example, using rags soaked in predators' pheromones or a silhouette, say of a bird that flies over the enclosure at random points in time. This might work in the short term, but many animals will quickly learn that these items do not mean danger, and therefore they will alter their behaviour appropriately, which can be very detrimental if these animals are to be released into the wild, as it only takes them not reacting to these stimuli once for them to become someone's dinner. The only option I see for zoos of the future is to have animal populations that are either going to be quickly released back into the wild, or they transition away from long-term displays of animals. What I mean by this is that instead of having a long-term population of, say, lemurs, you could instead have an immersive exhibit in which perhaps taxidermied animals are on display, which could honestly be done really, really well, and could be very engaging. But obviously this is not something modern zoos are likely to get away with, without playing the moral card for social clout. Because let's face it, living animals, moving, breathing and eating, are just more naturally entertaining than a still, stuffed one. However, in the future, this may be their only option for many zoos around the world, and so they should probably start getting good at it now. Let's move on to the animals which are actually kept in zoos currently. We as humans treat animals differently, with our moral consideration being based on how similar to ourselves we find them. For instance, it's almost unthinkable to feed a chimpanzee to a tiger, yet no one turns their head at feeding a mealworm to a bearded dragon. This moral bias influences how we treat and house such animals. Gorillas are expected to be housed in appropriate stimulating environments, given enrichment, and provided with good food, while animals like centipedes not so much. I think people who run zoos in the future will have to expand their moral consideration, because how are you going to provide a good environment for all the animals under your care if you don't care about all your animals? We know from years of research that zoos produce unique stressors for the animals housed within them. For instance, the persistent presence of humans and restricted ranges leading to stereotypies, the restriction on diet resulting in ill health effects, invasive medical procedures like insemination happening, enclosures which lack appropriate stimuli or have inappropriate stimuli, animals being housed alone, animals being overstocked, nocturnal animals being kept awake during the day, a lack of hiding places. The list just goes on and on and on. So it's no wonder that many captive animals have many mental and physical problems. Thankfully, the study into animal welfare continues to advance, and hopefully I can say we will continue to apply it and make captive animals' lives better. The zoos of the future should obviously utilize this research for each of the specific species. No housing polar bears in small enclosures when they need about 20,000 miles to explore. Zoos are therefore perhaps not the right type of organisation for these type of animals. So perhaps future zoos will do the wise thing and restrict themselves to only housing animals whose territorial needs they can accommodate. But what about the enclosures themselves? Well, we have seen considerable advancement since the concrete and metal bar enclosures of the Victorians. We have a trend in modern zoos using more naturalised and immersive exhibits for their animals. This not only provides these animals with a more stimulating setting, but it also creates a 3D environment in which there are many places for them to hide, and in which getting from one area to another requires them to physically exert themselves. Now, these enclosures should look and operate like you took a slice of the animal's native environment and translocated it into the zoo. Environments like these have the benefit of providing an environment for which the animal is adapted and also allows the offspring of said animal to become accustomed to such an environment, which offers them the opportunity to build the mental and physical skills needed for survival in the wild. The enclosures themselves could be great, but what would be better is if we didn't need them in the first place, if the animal's wild habitat was in good condition. More and more zoos have expanded beyond their own walls and seek to undertake in situ conservation by helping fund or directly by sending people to protect or restore habitats vital to their chosen species survival. For example, Nuki Zoo in Cornwall, England, has a project protecting palm civets in Vietnam. This obviously has to continue into the future, as zoos act as a sort of bank or ark for endangered species, and their survival and eventual recolonisation of their ancestral lands will rely heavily on places like zoos. I think that the end goal of a moral zoo should be that it has been so successful in its educational, conservational and scientific goals that it completely reshapes itself, being barely recognisable from their modern counterpart. There will always likely be need for a place to house some animals whose native home is under threat, but it's about how we treat these animals in the meantime and what can be provided to help fix the underlying issues, resulting in them being there in the first place. These future moral zoos should essentially be trying to abolish the need for them to exist at all. However, I am well aware that this is utopian thinking, and therefore quite impossible to achieve. But the perfect is the enemy of the good, and zoos can and should always strive to be more moral, and do better for their most important stakeholder, the ones there without choice, their animals.